want you to imagine Paul sitting in an Ephesian prison, probably malnourished, suffering horrific illness, alone in the dark and damp with the smell of rot and perhaps even excrement and death around him. Picture him either scribbling away on a small sheet of papyrus or squinting for lack of light, or else whispering through a slot in a door to Timothy some instructions about what to put in a letter to one or more of the Central Asian churches. Now, this is a far darker image than the usual portraits of Paul writing in placid solitude at a desk or sitting in comfortable quarters on a bed, quill in hand with a pensive look on his face, like he's just about to write 1 Corinthians 13, that famous love passage. What Paul experienced in an Ephesian prison was not serendipitous serenity, but searing hardship. Not soothing tranquility, but brokenness and anxiety. So it's all the more remarkable that it's from this tumultuous period of Paul's career that we get from him not only the letter to the Philippians, but also the letters to Philemon, to the Colossians, and what was very probably a circular letter to the Asian churches in the letter to the Ephesians. These 3 Asian letters, as I've called them, are all deeply connected at the level of the circumstances of their writing and in terms of their theological content. Each letter in its own way is a testimony to Paul's unquenchable passion for Christ, the poignancy of his prose, where he waxes eloquently on themes such as reconciliation and union with Christ. And it shows his pastoral care in seeking communities that embody the message of the gospel in their relations with one another. On background, Christianity first came to Ephesus through the Pauline mission, though it later became a hub for other Christian groups too, including those associated with the Apostle John. Paul's first visit to Ephesus was all too brief, lasting only a few weeks. Paul did, however, return to Ephesus probably during the summer of 52 AD, and he stayed there for the better part of 3 years, working in Ephesus and adjacent regions in Western Asia. Luke's account of Paul's Ephesian ministry is like a select slideshow of key events which transpired during this period. Luke describes Paul's ministry to a group of disciples of John the Baptist who were resident in Ephesus. Paul's initial preaching in a Jewish synagogue took place until he was forced to depart with his converts. And thereafter, Paul's daily discussions in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. It was during this period that Paul's co-workers probably established churches in the Asian cities of Pergamum, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Thyatira, and even in the western interior of Asia Minor in the Lycus Valley, among the towns of Laodicea, Hierapolis, and Colossae. This led a certain Demetrius, the silversmith, with no little bit of self-interest, to accuse Paul of atheism, impiety, temple robbery, and affronting the city of Ephesus and its divine benefactor, Artemis. He did it with a ferocious protest following after. Luke's account of what happened next is highly compressed, probably omitting details, and we have to wonder if this transpired exactly at the end of Paul's Ephesian ministry, or perhaps his enemies engaged in a protracted campaign against him. That is because Paul's ministry in Ephesus, on the whole, was a mixture of opportunity and opposition. During this period, Paul probably ended up in an Ephesian prison. Paul refers to the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia and how I fought wild beasts at Ephesus, which might be a discreet way of referring to a time of detention. This would be one of Paul's many imprisonments, which in this instance, he says, is for the cause of the gospel. Here he advanced the prospect of a capital trial and perhaps even death. In Romans, Paul praises Priscilla and Aquila, who risked their necks for him during this period. And in his letters, he mentions Aristarchus and Epaphras as his fellow prisoners. It is possible to connect some dots and to do some guesswork on how these 3 Asian letters were composed. First, while in prison, Paul received Onesimus, a slave who had either run away or absconded from his master Philemon, but who was now contrite and had come to faith in the Lord Jesus. Paul wrote to Philemon to receive Onesimus back, not as a useless and insolent slave, but as a brother in the faith. And he further hints that Philemon should release Onesimus into Paul's service. Second, to make matters worse, concurrently there was a new species of Jewish mysticism being commended to believers in the Lycus Valley. It's around Colossia. And sadly, with Epaphras away, that left only poor Archippus left to deal with the danger, a danger that he was probably ill-equipped to handle. So Paul and Timothy wrote a letter to the Colossians in general terms, ensuring that the believers would not be seduced by some form of Jewish philosophy centered on asceticism and angelic visions. And it was a letter to be delivered by Onesimus and Tychicus. Third, the letter to the Ephesians was very probably a circular letter meant as a general exhortation to all the Asian churches, written to bolster their sense of Christian identity in a pagan environment. It was based largely on Colossians, but made deliberately broader in content and scope, composed by Paul's co-workers while Paul was incapacitated, and then delivered by Tychicus in a circuitous journey around the region. And this is probably the letter that may even be identical to the letter to the Laodiceans. While Pergamum was the Roman capital of Asia, Ephesus was the larger and more prominent of the two cities. Ephesus was lauded by ancient authors as the first and greatest metropolis of Asia, the light of Asia, the market of Asia. And Ephesus was strategically located on key sea and land routes, which explains its commercial, cultural, and military importance. The interior of the city contained a magnificent amphitheater, aqueducts, gymnasium, a stadium, 2 agoras, impressive gates, and a basilica. In Paul's day, it had a population of around 200,000. Only Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch exceeded Ephesus in size and grandeur. While there had long been a Jewish community in Ephesus, material evidence is scant, and no synagogue has been uncovered to date. Jews were probably a significant minority in the city, but with a history of mixed relations with the city's officials and Greek populace. Colossae was one of the oldest cities in the Lycus Valley, located within southwestern Phrygia in the western interior of Asia Minor. However, Colossae became dwarfed by the larger nearby cities of Hierapolis and Laodicea, both of which were founded during the Seleucid era. They each had a population of around 10,000, though perhaps lesser for Colossae. The 3 cities of Hierapolis, Laodicea, and Colossae can all be reached by foot in a day by a robust hiker. Colossae has never been excavated, and only meagre remains of a necropolis, fragments of columns and architraves, some coins and pottery, and a handful of inscriptions have so far been uncovered. We sadly have to rely on more general information about the Lycus Valley in trying to gain a picture of what Colossae was like in the 1st century. The Lycus Valley was also subject to regular and violent seismic activity, so it's no surprise that Hierapolis and Laodicea suffered extensive damage from an earthquake that shook the region in the early 60s, and we can reasonably surmise that Colossae suffered the same fate. We know that Laodicea and Hierapolis were rebuilt, and while the archaeological evidence is scant, there is reason to believe that Colossae was at least partially reconstructed too, and certainly by the 2nd century, signs of civic life are detectable. But eventually, at some point during the Byzantine era, the populace abandoned the city and probably moved to the neighboring town of Cannae. When it comes to authorship, there have been few prepared to question Paul's authorship of the letter to Philemon. But Ephesians and Colossians have often been panned as non-Pauline or Deutero-Pauline. That conclusion is partly based on comparisons of style and language with the undisputed letters. But largely, we suspect, because they fly in the face of the liberal Protestant paradigm for reading Paul, which dominates the scholarly landscape and has so for several generations. Quite simply, Ephesians in particular, and Colossians to a considerable extent, seem to have a much stronger and higher view of the church, and indeed of Jesus himself, than many scholars have been prepared to allow. The real Paul, such scholars assumed, taught justification by faith. And since this was held to be radically incompatible with what was seen as a high view of the church, well, Paul then could not have written those letters. Sadly, despite the fashion of new political and sociological readings of Paul, no one seems to have noticed that Paul's vision of Christ as sovereign over the powers and his interest in forming and shaping the early communities really does map very well onto Ephesians and Colossians. You'd think that passages that speak of Christ's victory over the powers would get a green light from political readers who detect here Paul's Christology in its usual polemical posture, arrayed as it was against the powers of the evil age. Or else there would be acknowledgement that those texts which deal with ethnic unity in the churches embody central Pauline themes completely congruent with Galatians and Romans. Sadly, no. Instead, we hear the repeated mantra that Ephesians and Colossians are still on the dubious list, and sometimes even cited, astonishingly, as indicating an early Catholic social conformism with diminished apocalyptic enthusiasm and egalitarian ethos subsiding, settling down into the comfortable bourgeois existence of theological bureaucracy and ecclesiastical hierarchy. Arguments from style are clearly important in principle, but they are hard to make in practice. Consider this. There are big stylistic differences between 1 and 2 Corinthians. Does that mean we should reject one of them as inauthentic? I mean, the second letter to Corinth is much jerkier. Its sentences are dense and convoluted, bending back on themselves, twisting to and fro with language about God, Jesus Christ, money, Paul's ministry. The organization of material is much less crisp. There is far greater difference between those 2 Corinthian letters than there is between Galatians and Romans on the one hand, and Ephesians and Colossians on the other. Yet nobody casts doubt on the authenticity of 2 Corinthians. In addition, it's been recently argued that Ephesians and Colossians show evidence of a deliberate Asiatic style of rhetoric. That's a style of rhetoric that tends to be more ornamented, almost pompous, which Paul could easily have adopted for readers in Western Asia. At the risk of speculation, it's plausible that Paul penned the letter to Philemon himself. He collaborated with Timothy on the letter to the Colossians, and the letter to the Ephesians was written under Paul's supervision by his co-workers, based largely on Colossians and for the purpose of exhorting and encouraging the Asian churches. A further disputed subject is the precise nature of the philosophy which Paul believed that the Colossians were encountering. It is hard to determine the precise contours of the philosophy, since Paul speaks of it explicitly only at limited points, though he perhaps alludes to it in other places. Morna Hooker proposed that there were actually no false teachers in Colossae, and Paul merely wrote a general admonition to urge the congregations there not to conform to the beliefs and practices of their Jewish and pagan neighbors. But the portrayal of the philosophy seems far too specific, and the use of indefinite pronouns throughout suggests that Paul genuinely did have some group or individual in mind. Suggestions as to the character of the philosophy have been numerous and many. These include Ebionism, Essenism, Gnosticism, the mystery religions, syncretism, or any number of different Greek philosophies. The philosophy, as it's presented in the letter, was clearly indebted to Judaism in some form, given the references to keeping the Sabbath and circumcision and food laws. However, the references to the powers, the worship of angels, and asceticism, festivals, and wisdom, they could derive from a number of different religious and philosophical systems. If we add to that the melting pot of religions and philosophies and magic in the Lycus Valley, where syncretism was common, it further complicates our ability to concretely pin down the philosophy to any one particular school or religious movement. The most likely candidate for our mind is that the Colossians had encountered advocates of Jewish mysticism. This was a Jewish religious tradition that was being dressed up in the garb of Hellenistic philosophy and language, thus appealing to Gentile believers who were formerly pagans in the religious smorgasbord of the Lycus Valley.
Paul's letter to the Colossians is about wisdom. Wisdom incarnate, wisdom in practice, wisdom as God's gift to the world in Jesus the Messiah. The church in Colossae appears to be young. Paul has only just received news of it. So he, in prison in Ephesus, I think, is praying that God will fill them with the knowledge of what he wants in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, and in particular, that they will learn to live lives characterized by constant thanksgiving. He says that in chapter 1, verse 12, and frequently thereafter in this letter. This thanksgiving is itself to be shaped by wisdom itself, that is, by the Messiah himself. He is the place, he says, where you'll find all the hidden treasures of wisdom and knowledge, chapter 2, verse 3. And to express this, Paul writes or quotes the astonishing poem that we find in chapter 1, verses 15 through 20. This poem celebrates the Messiah as the one through whom all things were created and through whom all things are now reconciled. John, we remember, begins his gospel with his own obvious echo of Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. Colossians focuses on the same verse, re-expressed in poetry at once both simple and highly complex. The point through all this is that Jesus himself is the true image. Again, as in John, Jesus is the truly human one. Simultaneously, however, Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. Like the image in a temple, Jesus displays the God who is to be worshipped. Temple imagery, in fact, occurs regularly in Colossians. In him, says Paul, all the full measure of divinity has taken up bodily residence. And with Jesus' death and resurrection, all creation under heaven has heard the good news. Chapter 1, verse 23. Paul means that with these events, a kind of shockwave has gone through the whole created order. A new world has been born. And Paul intends that the little church in Colossae, as a new group of believers, will realize what it means to belong to it. This is all the more important because Paul has been aware, ever since the crisis in Galatia, that rival missionaries are likely to arrive telling people that they need to follow all the Jewish ancestral traditions, because such people will urge confused ex-pagan Messiah followers to take on complex lists of dietary or liturgical regulations. But this, he says, is to be resisted. What matters is Jesus, not human tradition. He is the true temple. In him you've already been circumcised, and the law and all its regulations have nothing now to say to you. Instead, Paul holds out the bracing picture of a genuine human existence discovered through dying and rising with the Messiah. He says, you've already died and been raised. You are already part of God's new creation. And the new version of humanity which you have put on is being renewed in the image of the Creator, bringing you into possession of new knowledge. What's this going to mean? Not only kindness and forbearance, but forgiveness, and above all, once more, thanksgiving. For the rest, Paul offers a shorter version of the household code in Ephesians, and he offers quite lengthy closing greetings, including a word about Onesimus, whose story we discover in the letter to Philemon. Paul hasn't yet visited the church in Colossae, but he hopes to be released from prison soon and to be able to come to see them. But they are already joined together in the strong bond of mutual affection and prayer. Love, he says, ties everything together and makes it complete. And this letter is part of the way in which Paul is putting that into practice. Paul's shortest letter, the letter to Philemon, is nonetheless profound. He writes this letter to Philemon, who's a householder in Colossae. Like all householders in the ancient world, Philemon had slaves, and one of them, Onesimus, had run away. That might itself warrant the death penalty. and anyone harboring a runaway would likewise risk criminal charges. But Onesimus had come to Paul, and under Paul's guidance, he had become a Christian. So what was Paul to do? We might prefer it if Paul had grandstanded, declaring that one should simply free all slaves at once. Instead, what he does is to put a time bomb beside the institution. And yes, we may regret that it took so long to explode. But in the meantime, he will do what he does best: reconciliation. That's going to be hard. Paul does hint later in the letter that Philemon might free Onesimus, but the first thing to happen is that Onesimus has got to go back to be reconciled, and Philemon has got to welcome him. They are already brothers in the Messiah, so nothing less will do. All this is summed up in the prayer which Paul reports himself as praying in verse 6. Paul is praying that the partnership he and Philemon enjoy, the fellowship in their shared faith, will have its powerful effect in bringing to realization, bringing to a practical result, the good things that, he says, are at work in us to lead us into the King, the Messiah. Paul's prayer is that this work, that which God is doing secretly within each person, will lead them to a reconciled unity. And the fact that we still have this little gem of a letter seems to imply that the appeal was successful. The letter we call Ephesians is a circular. The words in Ephesus in the opening address are a later addition to the manuscripts. A good guess is that Paul wrote it from prison in Ephesus itself to the small, recently founded churches in the wider district up the Lycus Valley, including to the churches in Colossae, Hierapolis, and Laodicea. The letter to the Ephesians divides easily into two. The first 3 chapters are framed with prayer. There's a long opening shout of praise, chapter 1, verses 3 to 14. There's intercession and celebration to which that gives rise through to verse 22. And then there is prayer for the whole church, prayer that the whole church will find love as its root and its firm foundation, the end of chapter 3. Paul is not only praying here, he is modeling a richly Trinitarian worship, celebrating the fact that Jesus is already enthroned as the world's true Lord. Paul's imprisonment, and the fact that the letter ends with a serious warning about spiritual warfare, indicate that the church is now living in a time of now and not yet. The balance of now, what's already happened, and not yet, what is still to happen, looks different from different angles of vision, but nothing is gained by forgetting the now just because circumstances are difficult. In between chapters 1 and 3, Paul briefly expounds the effect of the gospel. Sinners are rescued by grace through faith in order themselves to be agents of new creation, chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. And Gentiles are brought in along with Jews so that there is a single family, the ultimate new temple in which God himself dwells by the Spirit, chapter 2, verses 11 to 22. A community like this, he says, will be a standing sign to the powers of the world that Jesus is Lord and they are not, chapter 3, verse 10. The second half of the letter, 4, 5, and 6, is a sustained appeal for unity and holiness, 2 of Paul's constant themes. God gives the church multiple ministries, not to pull the community apart, but to enable it to grow like a single body. And this community must then live as renewed humans, avoiding the standard corruptions of the surrounding paganism. And this will show particularly in married life. And here indeed, Paul offers a glimpse in chapter 5 of a patterned understanding of the whole scriptural narrative, rooted in the first chapters of Genesis.